Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor, a podcast where I want to think more deeply with you about Christian faith and life. Hey, all you believers, non-believers, you unaffiliated believers, sort of believers, and you think I'm a believer's welcome. Welcome, you notorious 9%ers. My each and every unstudent. Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor. Life is weird, isn't it? Like, why does grass grow in my flower bed, but it won't grow where I purposefully seed it into my lawn? Or how come the moon looks so much bigger when it's low on the horizon, like it has the last 3 or 4 nights? Or just where do all those missing socks go? That's just to think of a few in my own recent experience. Or here's a couple others as I speak here in late September of 2018. Why do those who brazenly defy God's moral biblical commands take an imperious posture of moral superiority? I swear I'm living in a Salvador Dali painting, it's so surreal. Or why is it that with the Me Too movement, America is eagerly jettisoning its belief in legal due process? It's frightening, it's scary. And then here's a deep philosophical question for you. Really, why do people let their dog, who just ate a cat turd from out of the garden, why do they let that dog lick their face? I've never understood it. Oh, this is a fascinating time to be alive. Here's another wild question as we now move into my 14th episode on the afterlife. Did Jesus go to hell? First, does the Bible teach that? And second, what would be the point? Well, let's answer the second question first. The point, some theologians have argued, would be to fully pay the price for human sin. Jesus didn't only die on the cross to atone for the yuck, muck, sin, and infection that besets us all. They say he positively went to hell so that we don't have to. My most favorite theologian, Hans Urs von Balthasar, believed that Jesus, following his death, went to hell for the entire human race. Wait, you may be asking, how if hell is eternal, could Jesus go there and then leave? Well, first, know that, as Balthasar argues, quote, it's impossible, as some attempt to do, to reinterpret eternal punishment, kolossis aionios in Matthew 25:46. It's impossible to reinterpret eternal punishment as a temporally limited corrective punishment, end quote. The literary context is too strong there for such a reread. And in fact, the first century Jewish apocryphal literature, including 2nd Esdras, which I'm reading daily right now, it's fascinating, that 2nd century and 1st century Jewish apocryphal literature all present hell as never ending, as eternal. And that's all another way of saying that the Jewish context of Jesus' words also goes to hell's eternal nature. Now, von Balthasar was deeply informed by the apocalyptic visions of a woman named Adrienne von Speyer. She was a Swiss mystic and stigmatist. She had all kinds of apocalyptic wild visions, and they were good friends, and von Balthasar wove her visions into some of his theology, including that Jesus went to hell on Holy Saturday. He believed that God the Father forced Jesus to, quote, enter that which is the opposite of the Father, to enter that which has been condemned by God, in which God cannot be found, end quote. That as an an act of its supreme obedience and love, the Son went to hell and experienced the estrangement of sin. You can read all about that in von Balthasar's book, The Last Act, part 5 of his Theological Dramatics. So what's the point of a position like that? Why would someone argue for something like that? Well, let alone von Speer's visions. Balthasar argued that as a matter of total substitution. If you've had a theology class, you'll know that Western Christianity, Protestants certainly included, embraced the doctrine of substitutionary atonement. Jesus came to die in our place for sin. We sinned and thereby incurred a wounding or an infection or a debt toward God and actually toward creation. And Jesus, dying on Golgotha, paid that price for us. He became our sin. He died as our sin. He is the remedy for human sinfulness. That's Western Christianity, and that's a chunk of the New Testament. So von Balthasar here is merely upping the ante on that traditional substitutionary atonement doctrine. Jesus didn't only die for us, he went to hell for us. Here's von Balthasar again, quote, "In his obedience, the Son has followed his path to the very end, hell. And von Balthasar believed in hell, Jesus will meet every person who ever said no to God's offer of grace. In hell, as Lord, Jesus will confront unbelievers. Absolute God, Jesus overtakes the forsakenness of hell. God in the flesh, Jesus goes to hell to encounter all who are lost in their flesh to sin. And so those who are forsaken in hell will meet again the forsaken one, Jesus." It's really a kind of recapitulationist theory on speed for any grad students listening today. And please know that Balthasar believes that Christ will offer grace to the forsaken in hell. They still must say yes to escape hell. It's possible they could choose eternal damnation, but the offer was nevertheless made to them. Here's Balthasar again, quote, "Jesus will not do his work without the participation of people. They are not seized by redemption against their will. The decision to believe is not only God's gift, it is also their personal act." End quote. Now, my good listener, maybe you're sitting there drinking your guava kombucha thinking, what the hell? Literally, what the hell? I've never heard that Jesus went to hell in my whole life. Well, please know you're in good company. Balthasar's position is not even part of official Catholic dogma, but it is a fascinating question. Does the Lord love us so much that he went to hell for us? You'll likely be further surprised to know that the New Testament says that what happened to Jesus between his death and resurrection is that he went to the netherworld. The pertinent passages are Acts 2:27 and 1 Peter 3:18 through 20. There are other disputed passages. I'm going to note one of those. But Acts 2:27 lets us know that death could not hold Jesus down. Even though, like all people who died prior to Jesus coming, like them, Jesus went to Hades, but Hades could not pin him down there. He didn't decay there. He wasn't cut off there. That's Acts 2:27. Now, the probing, fascinating passage is 1 Peter 3:18 through 20. First, I'm going to read it, and then we're going to try to unpack what the meaning of it is. For Christ also suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order to bring you to God. Just right, there's that substitutionary atonement theory again. He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which he also went and made a proclamation to spirits in prison, who in former times did not obey, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah during the building of the ark, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were saved through water. It's a weird passage. But at bare minimum, we see again that following his death, Jesus went to the place of the dead. He went to Hades, and that makes sense because everyone went from this life into the next. But in 1 Peter, we learn that upon his arrival, unlike everyone else, Jesus was not inactive. He preached there. Verse 19. He preached, but he didn't evangelize. The word euangelizo, put into a verb form, is in fact found in chapter 4, verse 6. Jesus preaches to the dead in 1 Peter 4:6. But the dead there, the context seems to be the spiritually dead, or the Gentiles on earth who live contrary to the things of Christ. What Peter's saying in this passage is that Jesus didn't go and evangelize. He went there and preached. It's a preaching of vindication. He preached a kind of vindication while he was in the place of the dead. And I think that's kind of cool. I think it's very Jesus-y, right? Because what did he do for 3 years of ministry on earth? Preach. Preach about what? His kingdom and his lordship. What did he do when he showed up in the netherworld? What did he do when, as a disembodied self, right, because his body was still in the tomb in Jerusalem, what did he do when he reached the netherworld? Well, he did what the kind of thing Jesus always did. He preached. It's the nature of the word to speak. It's the very nature of God incarnate to communicate. But the issue for scholars is, to whom did he preach and about what? I want you to know there are 3, at least, that I'm going to go through, standard interpretations of this passage. To whom did he preach and about what? Well, the first standard interpretation is that this is not at all about a literal descent into prison or into the netherworld. Phulake is the word, prison there. These scholars argue that Peter is saying that Christ was preaching through Noah. If you go read the verses again, he's preaching through Noah. Evangelical theologian Wayne Grudem wrote, quote, "The position proposed, but not really defended long ago by Augustine, is that the passage refers not to something Christ did between his death and resurrection, but to what he did in the spiritual realm of existence or through the Spirit at the time of Noah." End quote. When Noah was building the ark, Christ in spirit was preaching through Noah to the hostile unbelievers around him. So no afterlife, post-mortem preaching. And the strength of this interpretation is that it accords with the literary context, which is always important. The weakness is that it takes a ton of work to get to how or why or whether Jesus was preaching through Noah. Was he preaching invisibly? Was he preaching symbolically? Was he preaching allegorically? Is Peter just saying Jesus preached through Noah? Why confuse those figures? And the Protestants, mostly, who take this position, want to avoid other metaphysical interpretations, and by doing that, they just create one big problem. Jesus was preaching through Noah, even though neither Noah nor the author of Genesis knew that. And again, they're solving one problem by creating a bigger problem. And I got to tell you, I don't like rationalizing the Bible to get around difficulties. But there's one position. It's not a literal descent. It was Jesus preaching through Noah. Second position is that Jesus was preaching to the spirits who are the souls of faithful Old Testament saints. So with this position, Jesus went and preached to Old Testament saints in the place of the dead so they could hear the gospel. And the gospel is something that they had already had faith that they were waiting for, we learn in Hebrews, right? And this notion he was preaching to Old Testament saints was the Protestant reformer John Calvin's position. Its strength, I think, is that it preserves the New Testament teaching that there's only one way to eternal life, which is Jesus Christ. Others, like our aforementioned von Balthasar, they extend this interpretation to a general preaching of Christ to the unevangelized in the afterlife. In other words, the historical position is on position B, Jesus went and preached Old Testament faithful saints. But different theologians over the centuries have tried to argue that this was not just preaching to Old Testament saints, it was preaching to everyone. So the theory is there's an afterlife and it's a timeless place, and when Jesus shows up there, he can preach to everyone who ever lives, who will ever have lived, and they will hear him. He doesn't need to keep going back after every person dies in order to preach onesie-twosies. It's a timeless place. He's a timeless person. He can preach there, and everyone who ever lived and died, including the unevangelized, including unbelievers, get to hear Jesus preach. It's interesting that this is also embraced by some Eastern Orthodox theologians and an author who is a favorite of many of yours, C.S. Lewis. He was an Anglican, and Lewis suggested this kind of thinking in The Great Divorce. Lewis believed it's possible that Jesus was preaching here to everyone who ever lived, so that if one never heard the gospel in this life, one could hear Jesus preach the gospel in the next life. Or if one already heard it in this life, one can see Jesus face to face in the next life, but one will hear him vindicate his own message. Now, I have to tell you, I don't believe this position, and I don't believe we should teach this because it unravels so much of what the scriptures are teaching. It unravels so much of what Jesus was emphatic about. The scriptures don't teach that there's a post-mortem encounter other than judgment. Oh, and just please know that a lot of those who follow Lewis say that those to whom Christ preached were not getting a second chance because they'd never heard the gospel in this life. If they'd heard the gospel in this life and then encountered Jesus in the afterlife, his preaching would be one of vindication, not evangelizing. There's position number 2. Position number 1, it's not a literal descent into the netherworld. Position number 2, Jesus goes and preaches to the faithful Old Testament saints. Position number 3, the spirits that Jesus encounters are the fallen angels, the demonic offspring, who had sex with women in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Now, I'll tell you up front, this is the position taken by the majority of scholars who actually take a position because it's such a strange passage. A lot of scholars just won't take a position. But those who do, among those who do, this is the majority position. And it has several strengths. First, in the New Testament, deceased human beings are always referred to as souls, psyche, suke. Spirits, unless it's qualified for us, always refers to non-human spiritual beings. And in this passage, he's preaching to non-human spiritual beings. It's also the case that apocalyptic Jewish intertestamental literature taught that the angels who transgressed their assigned places in the cosmos had been bound in prison, phulake. So the historical context of prison here in 1 Peter, phulake, is that there were fallen angels who were bound in the netherworld. So what Peter's saying here is Jesus went to Hades, phulake, prison, to vindicate himself. And then, interestingly, this interpretation, by tying things to Noah, also fits the larger literary passages context of water baptism. If you go read, you'll see that Peter then moves into a brief conversation about water baptism. And in the patristic world, in the ancient world, and in Eastern Orthodoxy today, water baptism is a Christian rite associated with deliverance from evil spirits. And Jesus is preaching to evil spirits here, to spiritual beings in the passage. And as I said, he's not evangelizing them, euangelizo, he's charizo, he's announcing. So he's announcing that he is victorious. He's announcing to those who opposed him earlier in history. He's announcing to those fallen angels that he's victorious. He's telling those fallen angels that even though they try to pervert things and ruin things, he nevertheless is Lord. Now, you guys, however we understand that passage, it gets pretty wild. And no wonder most pastors just avoid it altogether. And I want to look at another interesting passage with you. But first, shout outs. Sweet affirmation. Thank you, Jesse S., for your Patreon pledge. And man, I am so grateful, Corey B., for your Patreon promise. I'm glad to have you on board, brothers. My Patreon crew is helping me pay for RSS feed hosting, webpage design, hosting, equipment, advertising and promotional materials, and mailing. And you guys are the communal backbone of my efforts. If you're listening today, please prayerfully consider a Patreon pledge for the UU podcast. Tanya R., my God-given love, thank you for your Facebook share. Yous guys, Facebook shares are such an easy way for you to help me spread the word. Also, I invite you to go sign up as an email subscriber at www.uncensoredunprofessor.com. And I just asked my homies there for feedback on what episodes they would most like to hear in the near future. And thank you everyone who gave me that feedback. Isaiah, my friend, thank you for helping me with that technical issue. Much appreciated. And everyone, all my life I've loved being part of a team. I loved school sports for that reason. There's just nothing like accomplishing something meaningful with a group of other people. Jesus surely knew that when he was recruiting the disciples. There's nothing like the shared joy, the sense of camaraderie, of working toward a shared goal. It's all very rich. And I so treasure each and every one who in one way or another is helping me build this podcast. I have this crazy dream of making an imprint upon the church and edifying the church and encouraging the church to serve the world from the beauty and truth that is ours and the Lord of life, Jesus Christ. One final businessy thing. I'm preparing to make a video series. If you would like to donate money toward the equipment for that, please email me at uncensoredunprofessor@gmail.com. But really, thank you everyone who's helping. I'm so encouraged and I'm so pleased. Okay. Enormous intellectual engines turned back on. Come on, rev them up. Here's another passage that is used to argue for Jesus' descent into the netherworld. Ephesians 4:7-10. But each of us was given grace according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it is said, when he ascended on high, he made captivity itself a captive. He gave gifts to his people. When it says he ascended, what does it mean but that he also descended into the lower parts of the earth? He who descended is the same one who ascended far above all the heavens so that he might fill all things. So, you guys, this notion of descending and even descending into the lower parts of the earth has been used to argue for Jesus' Holy Saturday descent into the place of the dead. And I want to give you some possible interpretations of this passage. First, how should we understand this? Lots of scholars argue that the descent here is Jesus' incarnation. He lowered himself, and that would echo Paul in Philippians 2:7-8. He humbled himself. In an extreme act of humility, he didn't cling on to exaltation as God. The Word of God became a man, and even a dead man, and even a dead man who entered a shameful tomb, so that the lower parts of the earth are the tomb, in verse 9. So these scholars argue that this passage is merely poetic or symbolic about Jesus' humility and exaltation. It's not a difficult interpretation to grasp, right? Jesus did his salvation work and then gave the church gifts. That's the gist of it. That's position number one. A second position is that Jesus descended into the netherworld, into Hades, and led the faithful Old Testament saints out of captivity, out of Hades. So this is delving together with that earlier passage in 1 Peter 3 we saw about Jesus going and scholars arguing, preaching to Old Testament saints. So he preaches to Old Testament saints, or those in Abraham's bosom, Luke 16, and then leads them to heaven with him. And this one has Jesus sort of invading Hades, plundering it, taking those Old Testament saints who were with him there back up to paradise, to heaven, the intermediate state where they are waiting for the resurrection. Now, the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholics prefer this interpretation. They assert that the text says that Jesus, just like in 1 Peter 3, went to the lower parts of the earth and did something, preached, and emptied Hades. And they call all of this the harrowing of hell, or the plundering of hell. And they don't mean that Jesus himself suffered pain in hellfire there. They're not thinking like von Balthasar was, but he plundered hell. He went to the place of the dead, which was under Satan's control then, and he took back the keys to death, and he rescued the Old Testament believers, and that all makes Jesus now Lord over death, over Hades. But that's saying a lot more than the passage does, because the passage is ambiguous. Now, think with me. I want to clarify something, because across my PhD life, I've embraced that second position, that Jesus, post-mortem, went and preached to the Old Testament saints and took them back to heaven with him. I've taught that. There's good historical precedent for that. And then following other scholars, I would read Matthew 27:50, where it tells us Matthew 27:50 and 52, Jesus cried out in death, and then the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints, Old Testament saints, who had fallen asleep were raised. It all goes together to make a nice salvation of Old Testament saints kind of sandwich. Now, I don't doubt that Jesus could take captive back to paradise with him. But after further careful study this week, I don't think that this Ephesians passage is so direct. I want more. I want more than the passage gives us. But sometimes, you guys, we have to settle with what we actually have. And what we have with Ephesians 4, 8 through 10 here is an ambiguous passage. Because lacking other cues, lacking other contextual clues, and absent the Apostle Paul's physical presence that we could actually converse with him, we're left to wonder, what were the points of his remarks about descending into the lower parts of the earth? Did he say that just to set up Jesus' ascension? Because that's an important Jewish theme of redemption and vindication and glorification. Did he descend so he can then ascend? It's not really very clear. And I have to tell you, I don't like admitting that ambiguity. But that's my honest evaluation. Did Jesus go to Hades, the place of the dead? Well, if he died like all other people prior to his time had died and moved on, then yes, he went to Hades. If Acts chapter 2:27 is more than mere poetry, if it is indeed in expressing that Jesus died, but that death did not cause anguish or separation from God or decay for Jesus' self, then yes, Jesus went to the place of the dead. And if 1 Peter 3 portrays an actual event that when Jesus died he went and preached to fallen angels, then yeah, Jesus went to the netherworld on Holy Saturday. And I actually enjoy the notion of Jesus preaching to demons, right? This is my paraphrase. You foul spirits, you servants of perdition, you thought you could ruin my plan? I'm here as proof that didn't happen. I was crucified, and tomorrow I'll resurrect in my body, you fools. You couldn't stop me. How dare you oppose the Holy One? Me? I like all that, because I do believe there was an audacious quality to Jesus that we always pass over. Did he go to the place of the dead? Yeah. But did Jesus go to hell? Did, as my theological genius hero von Balthasar eloquently argue, Christ suffer in hellfire? No. Did Jesus take on the suffering of all in Gehenna? No. If we take the scriptures seriously and carefully, they are not teaching that Jesus went to hellfire. In fact, the scriptures teach us that on the cross, Jesus cried out, "It is finished." John 19:30. The work of atonement, the work of bringing us to God the Father, the work of forgiveness was finished on the cross. And that statement there is buttressed by the New Testament epistles. Jesus' atoning work was accomplished on the cross. Was Jesus the first and only Death Eater? Yes. He conquered death with his resurrection. Acts 2:27 is right. Hades couldn't hold him. Death could not putrefy his body or soul. Not even death could separate him from the Father's love. So yeah, he went to the place of the dead. No, he didn't go to hell. Yeah, he went to the place of dead and did something there. No, he didn't go and suffer in hellfire. And I think that's cool that Jesus went to the place of the dead and did something, because when I die Instead of myself going to the place of the dead, I am now, you will now, we will now go to be in the Lord's very presence. Just as he said to the thief on the cross in Luke 23:43, today you will be with me in paradise. So too will you and all people of faith in Christ go to be with him in paradise. Jesus' statement, you'll be with me in paradise, was echoed by Paul in Philippians 1. Christ will be exalted now as always in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, living is Christ, and dying is gain. My desire is to be with Christ, for that is far better. Philippians 1:20-23. And again, you guys, I think that's a beautiful thought. It's a beautiful hope. Jesus changed the way we die. No, he didn't go to hell and endure the punishment or shame or anguish of all who oppose God. But yes, Jesus did make it so that our death ushers us into God's own presence. Swig of coffee here. Death was an enemy, still is an enemy. But death, because of Christ's own death and resurrection, death has become a passageway to paradise. Please think carefully with me. Death is not our solution. Jesus is the solution to death. But Jesus is so majestic that he even changed death. When I die, I'm not going to the place of the dead. I'm going to be with him. When you die, you're going to be in the presence of Christ if you confess Christ. And that's a beautiful hope. What a vision. Hey, listen to this. You've heard my irritation about how people pronounce certain American states Oregon. But I got a couple more for you. Etc. Too commonly here I hear it said that way. Folks, etc. is a northern Turkish lettuce. Etc. is how it's pronounced. Look carefully, there's not even a K in the word. Here's another, ask. It is spelled A-S-K. But I hear people saying it like it's some big Valhalla Viking axe. Ask, like to ask a question is A-S-K. It's not something that you swing at someone else in conversation. May I ask you a question? Well, I suppose, but let me duck first. Oh, and speaking of acts, do you know the one I've struggled with my whole life? Sword. As a kid, I'd read that, and with great gusto, I'd pronounce that word sword. But, nah, it's just sword. Whew. Thank you for letting me confess all of that to you. I'm so relieved to get that off my chest. Well, you may be thinking, so Ed, if Jesus didn't go to hell, then why at all did you do this podcast? And first, I did it to think with you about biblical teachings about hell. Secondly, I want to model for you how doctrines get built and how they're sustained, or not, by biblical teachings. And third, to show you again, as I've done before, I did it last episode, in fact, we can agree with people on certain matters without agreeing with them on all matters. I love von Balthasar. No one in my life has helped me understand the beauty and the existential depth of Jesus of Nazareth, the way that my now departed Catholic, Jesuit, Swiss theologian friend has. I'm going to have a cup of coffee with him in the afterlife. And it's not just that VB is eloquent. It's not just that he understands and can dialogue with and critique all of Western philosophy. It's that his soul rings with the beauty of Christ. Reading Balthazar makes me want to follow Jesus more zealously, love Jesus more earnestly, worship Jesus more fervently. But I can't agree with von Balthazar on Jesus going to hell. It isn't biblical, and it isn't necessary. In my next episode, my last one on the Heaven and Hell series, I'm going to wrestle with the question, what about those who never hear the gospel? Do they automatically go to hell? Hey, if you're listening on iTunes, would you please go there and rate the show? Again, it just helps build momentum. Thank you for doing that. And thank you for thinking with me today. Thank you for taking the time to be critically minded about your faith. I am grateful for church sermons. They're godly blessings. But with the UU podcast, I intend for your critical Christian thinking to increase. This podcast, the UU, is a place where you can come and invest in your Christian walk, in your own critical mindedness. So again, thanks for thinking with me today. And turn your brains on, everybody.